What on earth are you doing, Benjamin?
The door swung open. Richard Hale froze. Before him stood his 6-year-old son, his bare head exposed after weeks of chemotherapy, holding a buzzing hair clipper. Kneeling at the boy's feet was the new maid Nina Moore, her once tight curls hacked unevenly with clumps of hair scattered across the carpet like evidence of some strange ritual. Richard's voice cut through the air sharp and cold. Nina flinched, her hand still resting on the boy's shoulder. Richard rushed forward, pulling his son behind him, his eyes sweeping over the mess on the floor. What kind of twisted stunt is this? Look at yourself. Do you even look normal anymore? Benjamin shrank back, his frightened eyes flicking toward Nina, too afraid to speak. Richard gripped his son's shoulder tighter and turned on Nina. I hired you to clean, not to play mind games with him. Nina swallowed hard, her voice trembling but firm. I just wanted him to know. He's not alone. If he looks in the mirror and sees me like him, maybe the fear won't feel so heavy. Richard's voice snapped like a door slamming shut. Enough. Silence stretched thick and suffocating. Nina tightened her grip on the clipper while Benjamin's eyes locked on hers, desperate to say something he couldn't put into words. Richard leaned down and whispered, It's okay, Ben. Daddy's here. He led his son away, leaving Nina sitting on the floor, damp curls clinging to her cheek. Outside, rain hammered against the window, heavy as the heartbeat of a woman denied the chance to explain. The next morning, when Nina stepped into the kitchen, the housekeeper was already waiting. Mr. Hale said, Today will be your last day, she murmured, her eyes avoiding Nina's. Nina gave a small nod, asking nothing more. In her tiny downstairs room, she folded each worn piece of clothing into her old canvas bag. Outside the window, raindrops from the night before slid slowly down the glass. As she stepped out of the mansion, Nina pulled her collar high against the damp chill, walking quickly down the stone path. The heavy door closed behind her with the finality of a period at the end of a sentence. Upstairs, Benjamin cracked open his bedroom door and whispered Miss Moore no reply. He ran through every room, the living room, the kitchen, even the garage, but found only emptiness. At last, he returned to his room and quietly opened his desk drawer. Wedged between pill bottles and forgotten toys was a crumpled drawing himself, and Nina, both bald, sitting side by side, smiling brightly. He folded the paper into the smallest square possible and tucked it deep into his hoodie pocket as though afraid someone might steal it away. Night fell. The house sank into silence, broken only by muffled sobs from Benjamin's room blending with the patter of rain against the glass. The new nanny, a middle-aged woman, clumsily tried to soothe him. Come on, Ben, sleep. Tomorrow will be better. But the crying didn't stop. Richard stood outside the door, his fist curling and uncurling. After a long moment, he turned away, leaving the bedroom light burning all night. The next afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the backyard shimmering with puddles. The pool lay uncovered, its surface still and cold as glass. Just a few laps, okay, the nanny coaxed, holding a towel, her voice uncertain. Benjamin clutched the railing, shaking his head. Ben, deep breath. One step. She tugged his wrist lightly. His small foot slipped on the damp tile, the squeak of rubber against stone breaking the stillness. Benjamin staggered. Mom! The memory tore open, the sound of water shattering, a woman plunging in wet hair plastered to her face, someone shouting, Call 911, then silence, salty and suffocating. Benjamin collapsed to his knees, gasping, his hand sliding from the railing. At that instant, a dark blur dove into the water. Splash! The surface erupted. Strong arms wrapped around him, twisting to shield his head. A familiar voice trembling from the cold. I've got you, Ben. Don't be afraid. Nina. She had been walking past, drawn back by the ache of missing him, and in that moment she jumped. Kicking hard, she pressed him tight against her chest, driving toward the pool's edge. Hold my shoulder, Ben. Look at me. In, out. Breathe with me. Her brown eyes filled his vision, steady and luminous, even as water streamed across her face. Slowly, his breaths matched hers. Together they reached the side. Nina braced a hand on the steel ladder, lifting Benjamin out first before pulling herself onto the wet stone. He shivered violently, then threw his arms around her neck, sobbing, Don't go. Footsteps thundered. Richard appeared at the glass doors, rain streaking his shirt. He froze at the sight, Nina dripping, cradling his son. The nanny stammered excuses, but Richard said nothing, only staring from Benjamin to Nina. 2 silent seconds hung like a still frame. Nina draped a towel over Benjamin's shoulders. "You're okay," she whispered. But he clung tighter, crying harder. "Don't make her leave again." Richard dropped to his knees, trying to pry the small hands away. "Daddy's here." Benjamin shook his head, tears streaming. Daddy, don't make her leave." Nina closed her eyes, steadying herself. She bent low, her voice soft but resolute. "I'm not your nurse. I'm the one who shows up when you're scared, even if I'm standing outside the gate." Benjamin lifted his wet eyes. "Promise, promise." She placed his hands into Richard's. "Keep him warm." Then she rose, turned, and walked down the slick path, wet shoes slapping softly in the puddles. "Stop," Richard said, almost without thinking. Nina paused. He looked down at his son, red-eyed, clutching his hand, watching her fade. Richard whispered, "Thank you." Nina gave the faintest nod, then kept walking. The side gate closed with a low, metallic thud. That night, a fine mist of rain drifted down. Richard sat by the bed, listening to the broken rhythm of his son's breathing. "Ben, what happened at the pool?" he asked quietly. The boy turned to his pillow, silent for a long time. Then finally, "She jumped before I fell." "Why were you scared?" the nanny asked, gently holding a towel. Benjamin's voice cracked, echoing down the hall. "I want Miss Moore. Daddy, I want her." The woman fumbled. "Ben, it's late. You need to rest." But the boy shook his head violently, like a trapped bird crying for freedom, calling out only one name. Halfway up the stairs, Richard froze. Each sob wound a rope tighter around his chest. He stepped into the room and sat at the edge of the bed. "Bring her back," Benjamin begged, gripping his father's hand with desperate strength. This was not childish anger. It was raw, aching need. Richard swallowed hard, unable to speak. 30 minutes later, the black Bentley rolled to a stop at Riverside Park. The Hudson River's night wind bit into his face. Under the faint yellow glow of a street lamp, Nina sat hunched on a bench, tugging her thin coat close, her curls tossed by the wind. Beside her sat the faded canvas bag. She looked up as footsteps neared. Mr. Hale. Richard stopped in front of her, his voice low, heavy. "Says I was wrong." She stayed silent, her gaze falling to the shine of his leather shoes. "Ben's been calling your name all night," Richard said, his voice almost breaking. "I thought I was protecting him. But the truth is, I was only protecting myself." And now he drew a deep breath. "Now I'm asking. Come back, not for me, for him." The sound of the car faded into the distance, blending with the rustle of dry leaves scraping across the road. Nina looked at him for a long moment before giving a small nod. "Only because of the boy," she said softly. Richard exhaled, as if laying down a burden he had carried too long. Lifting his bag, he opened the car door. "Let's go home." She didn't ask what home meant. But when she stepped into the warm interior of the car, her hands still clutched the strap of her bag, and her eyes lingered on the golden light of the park receding behind them. At the mansion, young Benjamin had drifted into sleep, still wearing his hoodie, his small hand clutching a folded drawing. The bedroom door opened quietly. Nina slipped inside, kneeling beside his bed. His eyelids fluttered, half opening his voice, a fragile whisper. "You came back." She smiled, resting her hand on his forehead. "I promised I would." The next afternoon, the room glowed warmly under a desk lamp. On the bed lay a small black tuxedo and a crisp red bow tie inside a box. Nina opened it with careful hands, setting the outfit on the blanket, as if performing a quiet ritual. "Tonight is the fundraising gala for the Children's Cancer Hospital," she explained gently. "The people there, they're the ones helping kids like you." Benjamin slipped on the tuxedo and stood in front of the mirror. For a moment, he was silent, then touched his reflection and shook his head. Without a word, Nina went to the drawer and pulled out clippers. Not short enough yet. The hum of the machine filled the room as soft curls tumbled down onto the polished wooden floor. When she looked up, his bare scalp shone under the light. Benjamin stared at her for a beat, then burst into laughter. The sound rang out bright and clear, echoing down the once cold hallway. Passing by, Richard stopped short. In the doorway, he saw 2 bald heads tilted toward each other, glowing in pure joy. His chest tightened with an emotion unfamiliar to a man who usually hid behind contracts and balance sheets. He lifted his phone and snapped a photo, not to show anyone, just to keep. That evening, beneath the crystal chandeliers of the grand hall, Richard sat between Benjamin and Nina. The master of ceremonies spoke of children forced to abandon treatment because their families could no longer pay. In the past, Richard had only seen such stories as sterile numbers in financial reports. Tonight they appeared as real lives reaching into the heart of a father. The music softened. A spotlight swept across the hall over rows of guests in evening gowns and tuxedos, all hushed, listening to tales of children who had been stopped mid-treatment by financial ruin. Richard sat steady, yet in his mind the numbers turned into faces, childish eyes, bald heads, hidden tears. Benjamin's small hand squeezed his. On the other side, Nina bowed her head silent, though her eyes brimmed with unspoken words. Richard drew a deep breath, placing his other hand against his chest, where his heart pounded. He rose to his feet. The scrape of his chair made the hall fall silent, every gaze turning. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice cracked at first, then steadied. "My name is Richard Hale. For years I've viewed these stories through papers and figures, and I was wrong. These children are not numbers. They are lives. They are hope. They are laughter, just like my son." All eyes fell upon Benjamin, his bald head gleaming beneath the lights, his tiny tuxedo almost too small. The boy bit his lip, but his eyes shone brightly. Richard swallowed, his voice firm now. "Tonight I pledge to establish an annual foundation for the Children's Cancer Hospital. No child, none will ever have to stop treatment because of another bill." The hall froze in reverent silence. Then applause swelled like a wave, mingling with muffled sobs. Benjamin looked up at him, smiling for the first time in months. Nina turned her eyes toward Richard, quiet, but alight with something new, a trust she hadn't expected to feel. Later that night, when the chandeliers had dimmed and only a few staff lingered to clean, Richard's Bentley glided slowly home. Inside, Benjamin slept soundly, his face at peace after endless days of medicine and fear. In his hand, he still clutched the folded drawing himself and Nina, two bald heads laughing together. Richard's gaze softened on his son, then shifted to Nina beside him. She adjusted the shawl around the boy's shoulders, her presence no longer just that of a housekeeper nor an intruder in his carefully ordered world, but a missing piece he hadn't known he needed. Richard's voice was low, almost unsure. "Tonight, I never thought I'd stand before people and say those words. If it weren't for you, I'd still be hiding behind numbers." Nina didn't answer, only nodded gently. What mattered wasn't an apology, but that he finally saw Benjamin didn't need pity. He needed someone to walk beside him. At home, it was late. Richard tucked his son carefully into bed. Benjamin stirred half asleep, murmuring Miss Moore. "Don't leave again." Nina bent close, touching his forehead with a finger. "I promised, remember." The boy smiled faintly before drifting back into peaceful dreams. Outside, the rain had stopped. A pale moon broke through the clouds. Richard stood at the window, shoulders relaxed at last. Turning, he saw Nina still seated by the bed, her bald head tilted toward the child like a gentle sentinel. In that moment, he realized some people don't come into our lives to replace anyone, but to fill the spaces we never knew were empty. Quietly, he pulled a chair beside them. No distance now, only the steady breathing of a child and the quiet warmth of a family mending itself. That night, the lamp beside the bed glowed, and in that small room, darkness no longer felt threatening. Months later, spring washed over the city. Swallows swooped across the young blue sky, a promise of renewal. In the courtyard of the Children's Hospital, tulips bloomed brightly along the paths. Benjamin, hair growing back in soft wisps, ran down the hallway, his old hoodie still draped over his shoulders like a charm. Richard walked behind him carrying a small bouquet. His eyes, once heavy, now shone with lightness. Beside him, Nina carried a tin of cookies she had baked the night before, the warm scent of butter and cinnamon drifting through the air. Children on the playground spotted her and ran over. "Miss Nina's here," they cried, throwing tiny arms around her. A doctor approached Richard with a handshake. "The Hale Foundation has kept treatment going for dozens of children. You've changed more than you realize." Richard hesitated, then smiled faintly. His eyes went to Benjamin, who was sharing cookies with his friends. And he knew it was truly his son and the humble woman beside him who had changed him. In a sunlit room, Benjamin climbed onto a chair, to speak before a group of parents and young patients. His voice trembled, but was steady. "I used to think I was all alone, but now I know. There will always be people who come to us even when we're most afraid. None of us has to fight alone." Silence fell, then applause burst forth like a flood. Nina stood quietly in the crowd, clutching her old canvas bag, tears glistening in her eyes though her smile was radiant. Richard looked at his son, his heart brimming with a faith he had never known. They weren't just surviving fear. They were writing a new chapter where love was stronger than the dark. Outside, spring sunlight bathed the hospital yard. Benjamin reached for his father's hand and Nina's, their three small shadows stretching across the red brick path. In that moment, they were no longer employer maid and sick child. They were a family, not by blood, but by love, courage, and a promise kept. The story of Richard, Benjamin, and Nina closes not with tears, but with a quiet reminder, sometimes the smallest moments. A hug, a promise, a shaved head can rescue a soul. Family is not only where we are born, but also where we are chosen. And sometimes the greatest change in a man's life begins with the tears of the child he loves. If this story touched you, please give it a like to spread its message of love, subscribe, so you don't miss other heartfelt journeys, and share this video with someone who needs hope today. Because who knows, you might be the one who shows up for them when they're most afraid.